overuse meetings instead of using asynchronous forms of communication. So all of these things, and of course there is the issue of inclusion or lack of inclusion, not feeling respected, lack of diversity, both of identity but also of perspective. So all of those things made me
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce herself. Tosca, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. I am Tosca Bruno-van Vijfeijken. That is a mouthful, and I am currently an independent consultant. I am the owner of a small consulting practice called 5 Oaks Consulting, which is named, in case you're wondering what a weird name that is, it's named after my Dutch last name, Van Vijfeijken, which is difficult to pronounce, but in Dutch, it literally means I am called Tosca of the 5 oak trees. And I assume, Morris, you're going to ask me in a moment to tell a little bit more about myself, so I'll keep it there for now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as most of the listeners know, I'm also from the Netherlands, so you're listening today to two folks that have their roots in the Netherlands. Yeah. We met though in the US, right? And
absolutely.
Actually, I attended one of the courses that you were teaching at Syracuse University, right? So
yeah,
I hope that you will also explain a little bit about, that the work that you did before you started your own company. But before we go there, Tosca, tell us about, you are from the Netherlands. Are you really born there? Were you born and raised there? And how did you ultimately end up in the US? So,
yes.
Yeah. But
okay.
Talk us through that.
Yes. So yes, I was born in the Netherlands, and I lived there for the first 30 years. So how did I end up in the United States? So I started my professional life as your standard international development practitioner. Mm-hmm. So I had worked in the Netherlands with an EU-focused think tank, the European Center for Development Policy Management, and then went, quote unquote, overseas. I started working in Cambodia with the United Nations peacekeeping operation. And then I stayed on to work for UNDP as a consultant and with an American NGO, PACT. That is, by the way, during those first 5 years, I already started working with and on the topic of NGOs. Mm-hmm. In Cambodia, at that time, in the only swimming pool in Cambodia in 1992, so not long after the genocide of Pol Pot and his regime was over, I met my current husband, Jim Bruno, and he's an American, and he was at that time a diplomat. He had just arrived to open a new American-Cambodian relationships. And so indirectly, via, I ended up in the United States after having worked in Cambodia, Vietnam, shorter period in Laos, and I've also worked in Southern Africa. So I studied at the bachelor level, I studied public administration already with a focus on developing countries, and then did my master's in international relations and political science, with a focus on what we used to call developing countries back then. Mm-hmm. And these days, some people still call global South countries. I did not want to be a do-gooder. That was actually quite important to me. I just wanted to work on a public cause that was motivating to me, and I wanted to do as high quality work as I could. And I'm saying that because even now in my observations on the sector, etc., the topic of doing good and helping, quote unquote, etc., I continue to see reverberate sometimes in a less than helpful way, although we are also thankfully questioning that and critiquing that more and more, but maybe we'll get to that.
And so I understand that, but then, where did you find that motivation then to choose that particular study that you chose? Is it because, your parents were in the same sector? Did you have other family members, or, was the book that you read? How did that come about?
None of the above, Morris.
Okay.
Although my father indirectly had something to do with it. My father worked at, for most of his 40 years that he was in the workplace, he worked for Philips Electronics. And what was really formative for me is that he, around the time I was a tween, let's say in my early teens, he started bringing home occasionally to our small town in the south of the Netherlands. He brought home a foreign colleague. I remember till this day, Indian colleague. I remember an Irish colleague. And those discussions around the dinner table in English, when I was practicing my best English at that time, that really, Morris, sparked my interest to do some kind of an international work. And when I started with law, because I didn't know what else to do after I had decided not to pursue another direction that I had in mind initially, I knew immediately that from law I wanted to move into public management and public administration, because I was always interested in government and what government can do for society and those public causes that I mentioned. And from the beginning, I was interested in the relationships between government actors and nonprofit or non-governmental actors.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I have two brothers. I'm the eldest, and some would say that in my behavior that shows sometimes. So yes, and I have really great brothers. They're great guys, and I'm very grateful till today that I have such good relationships with my brothers. And
where do they work? And were they exposed? Are they the same age? So were they exposed to the those foreign colleagues of your dad as well?
We're all about 2 years apart, so they definitely were at the same dinner tables. They did not at all share that interest in that sense, although we are all fairly globally minded. But I wouldn't say that we were a typical family of either development workers or of diplomats or relief workers. So no, it was a little bit different than that. I will say that both my youngest brother and myself both married a non-Dutch person. So that, I guess. Okay. And my father also, I should mention, my father took, well, he was basically allowed by Philips to take a 4-year break to be a professor at the first private sector university in the Netherlands, Nijrode University. And he went to China during a summer for about 9 weeks or so, and I think that was also another kind of little seed that was planted.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks for that, Tosca. So let us jump. You met your husband in the pool in Cambodia.
Yeah.
You get married in the States, or you get married in Cambodia, or in the Netherlands?
Officially married in the Netherlands. And we did have, of course, a big party also in the US for those relatives or friends who couldn't make it to the Netherlands. I will also maybe one fun fact about my wedding is that we actually had a joint wedding of my youngest brother, who I just mentioned. He is also married to an American. Yeah. And so Ivan and I and Jim and Arlene decided we both got married in the same year. And so we both wanted to have a big celebration in the Netherlands, and we decided to have a combined wedding. So that was a little unusual.
Yeah, cool though. So did he end up in the US, living in the US as well?
They have together never lived in the US. They have lived in London, and they have since for about 20 years now, they live in the south of the Netherlands, where we are from. He actually lives, his house is right across from our high school.
Okay. Wow.
Yes. But again, they're also a global or international family.
Yeah, yeah. So, then you decide to go to the US. Take us through, what happened then? What did you start to do?
Well, that was tough, actually, Morris, because long story short, so Jim Bruno, my husband, and now a retired US diplomat, he and I were still only dating, and we were shacking up, if you will, in Cambodia. We were living together, but we had not yet decided whether to get married. And so when we moved together to the US, because he needed to go back to the US, for that first year, I did not have the right visa to seek work, right? I couldn't work.
Yeah.
And I could have meetings, but I was not legally allowed to work. So what is also fun is when we finally decided to get married, we first did kind of a justice of the peace kind of legal wedding. So that the same afternoon, as soon as the ceremony was over, we drove to the post office in a remote town of Vermont and put my application for a green card in the mail, because the World Bank by then had offered me a job, and I had to take that within a certain time frame. Otherwise, they would have to give up the offer.
So after the NGO world, you went to the World Bank.
Yeah, well, at the think tank in the Netherlands, I'd worked on governance issues in Africa, in governments in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, but already, indeed, amongst others, their relationship to non-government actors, how they were interacting. Yes, and then I went to the World Bank, and I worked 2 years in its headquarters in DC, and 4 years in Vietnam, where I was in charge of a small team of Vietnamese social scientists and myself working on social development. What was really exciting about the time when I entered the World Bank, this was in the mid to late 90s, and the World Bank basically had decided it needed to become more poverty focused, more social development focused, and more environmental protection focused. And so I was part of this big wave of social scientists that entered the World Bank to try to change it from within. And this, of course, had happened after much critique had been directed at the World Bank by both academics and analysts, but also by NGOs, obviously.
I would like to take the jump to Syracuse University, and because, that's how we got to know each other. And I really enjoyed going to the course, although I've forgotten the exact title now, so you'll probably remember that. I would like to have 2 questions for you about that. One is, how did you end up, as a teaching at Syracuse University and, involved in that course? And second, why did you decide to leave? Because I my experience was great. You were a great teacher. The course was wonderful.
Thank you.
Take us through those 2.
Yeah, that's also kind of interesting. The funny thing is, Morris, and I know we Dutch people have a reputation for being sometimes overly planful and structured in our ways of thinking. And I'm afraid I have some of these tendencies. So I am very planful, but actually most of my weaving through sectors, because I've worked in a think tank, I've worked in the United Nations, with the United Nations, with NGOs, with the World Bank, and now we're going to talk about academia. All of that was completely unplanned. So that's always the irony of life. So basically, once we had been in Vietnam for 4 years, and we came back to Jim, my husband, is originally from upstate New York. So I don't live in New York City. This is a very important part of my identity as well. I live in the rural part of New York State, near the city of Syracuse. once we decided to live in the center of upstate New York, around Syracuse, it was very quickly clear to me that there would be no work to be had there for an international development practitioner. And so basically, long story short, my only opportunities for work would be with a local nonprofit that would have been very social work focused. I did not, my expertise and my experience profile did not match that. I would not be very useful to them. And the other was upstate New York has a number of really good colleges and universities. And I very accidentally ended up being what I call jokingly an accidental academic at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, public management, at Syracuse University. And the funny thing is that the Maxwell School is pretty underbranded. So it happens to be already for 20 years in a row consecutively the best graduate public management program in the US, according to a very contested, I should say, ranking system, but judged by other academics in the field of public management as the best school. But yet, for instance, the Harvard Kennedy School of Government is much better known because Harvard has a huge brand name, right? But the Maxwell School is very good. So I just accidentally ended up there through some networking that I did and ended up more than 10 years there. So what I did there is 3 or 4 things. One is, you mentioned teaching. Yes, I did teach at the graduate level, and I liked that very much, although teaching is also scary. I initiated research and as well as contributed to research. Some of that research was almost consulting-like, was very practitioner focused and meant to be of use to practitioners and actual NGOs, because the initiative that I led there was called the Transnational NGO Initiative. And we focused on 3 things. One, the NGO always being the unit of analysis, meaning the organization of the NGO, not the content of what it worked on programmatically, but the organization being the unit of analysis. So leadership development and effectiveness, governance, and organizational effectiveness. So besides the teaching that I mentioned and the research, our mission was to be directly relevant to practitioners. And so that practitioner-facing piece consisted of 2 things, and you experienced one of them. So that was a senior leadership training program. We ran about 22 of those. One was an open enrollment program out of Syracuse, and you were one of our alumni. And another set of programs were custom built for a group of big global NGOs. So ActionAid International, Greenpeace International, Amnesty International, and Oxfam International, and later Civicus also joined. We delivered for them 7 years in a row, also a program. So that's how you and I met. And the other part that was practitioner facing was on change management. So 4 big NGOs, Save the Children, Oxfam, CARE, and Amnesty International, asked us to help them doing an external assessment of what was the effectiveness with which these big NGOs both led and managed organizational change processes, pretty big organizational change processes. And that is why change management became one of my all-time favorite topics. And within that, I love the topic of organizational culture, and I think I'm a little bit of a geek on that. So that's basically the body of work that I contributed to there. Also, we did student advising, of course, and student programming. So we brought NGO leaders like yourself and others to campus for students to interview and to offer speaking engagements. We also had a visiting fellow program.
Then after 10 years, you do a scary thing because you're leaving, a job where everything is taken care of, right? Because, you know how to run successful courses. You are in an institution, so in that sense, you're protected. Then you decide to start your own company. So why and how is that going?
Okay, why and how's it going? So first of all, I was ready for change. I am somebody who likes to be challenged by change regularly.
Okay.
I don't always find it easy, by the way, and definitely sometimes scary, including what I'm doing now. But at the same time, I need change. And I realized I had both, after at that time about 26 years or so of relevant experience, I thought I was ready to be an advisor to senior leaders and managers. And at the same time, so while I had worked in a think tank, United Nations, World Bank, NGO, and academia, I had never worked in the private sector. And now I have to run my own little business. And honestly, Morris, when I started 4 years ago, I knew nothing about how to run a business, but I learned on the job. And that learning is so stimulating for me. So I do not regret it for an instance. I will say it's not for the faint of heart.
But then still you could go for starting a company with somebody else. You decided to do it by yourself, right? Is that correct or not?
That is correct. I do have a number of collaborators, right? Okay. But they are not employees. And some of these collaborators I work with on a more or less permanent, though part-time, in a permanent, though very part-time capacity. But yes, I wanted to have, I wanted to enjoy the autonomy and the freedom to shape this small company, Five Oaks Consulting, in my own way, and therefore also having to learn a whole bunch of things on my own. I definitely was not interested, and I'm still not interested, to join a big consulting company.
Okay. Although, a lot of marketing people have explained to me that, the elevator pitch doesn't exist anymore. But I'm still asking you to, when we would be in the elevator, and I ask you to explain about what your company has to offer and what you're passionate about, to explain that to me, within that time frame. So
okay, I'll give it a go. So I help senior leaders of nonprofits, INGOs, and philanthropic organizations turbocharge their ability to lead dramatic and useful change. I do that in 4 ways. I offer, not surprisingly, senior leadership development support. So whether that is leadership training, as we've discussed, whether that is individual coaching, or my new capability in team coaching that I hope we will get to talk about. The second offering is change management advice. I mentioned that. The third offering is governance reviews and or organizational effectiveness reviews. And the fourth offering is facilitation.
You wrote a book called Between Power and Irrelevance, the Future of Transnational NGOs, together with Hans-Peter Schmitz and George Mitchell. How do I need to see, or how do we need to see that book in relation to your organization?
Okay, so it's a good question. Yeah, so first of all, very important to say that I am only one of the 3 co-authors of this book, and that Hans-Peter Schmitz and George Mitchell did a lot more of the final drafting of the book, because they are simply better writers than I am. That book, by the way, is published by Oxford University Press. Also important to mention, and it was published in 2020. Important to mention also Barney Talek. He is another practitioner like myself, very well known in Europe when it comes to change strategy and a number of other topics. And he was a contributor to some of our chapters. So basically, Morris, that book is the product of 15 years of Hans-Peter, George, and I collaborating at Syracuse University. Okay. And so we collected a lot of data, but not just classical kind of data that researchers might think of, but as much direct observations from practitioners, because I interviewed hundreds, probably 500-600 NGO leaders. We did the consulting assignments that I mentioned on change management. The 22 or so senior leadership training programs gave us a lot of qualitative information, how leaders talk about change, right? And about leadership and about governance, etc. And all of that data and more, data also coming from interaction CEOs and so on and so on, was all captured in that book. So we started writing that book towards the end of my 10 plus years at Syracuse University, and we finished it in the summer of 2019. So that's important to understand that the manuscript was delivered to the publisher a full year before the pandemic and a full year before George Floyd's murder and all the attention that went subsequently to, once again, to anti-racism, decolonizing aid, to diversity, equity, and inclusion, etc.
What is the main argument you make in the book?
And I should say the book is primarily drawing on data from Global North founded NGOs.
Okay.
There is some data on Global South founded NGOs, but that was not the core of our expertise. So the main argument in the book is, and I'm going to have to summarize, so it's going to sound maybe a little bit unnuanced, but that our sector of INGOs, not just in the US, importantly, but in many countries, though not necessarily all, that the institutional form of the NGO is still based in the legal form of the charity, that NGOs are still charity organizations, right? And that therefore we are still embedded in a charity architecture that comes with legacy structures and belief systems and practices that actually limit our ability to adapt to our aspirations as INGOs that have expanded a lot, because we started, as you know, historically, many of us started as purely focused on material improvement of people's lives, right? Kind of what we originally mean by charity. And gradually we've expanded our aspirations to go to human needs approaches, then rights-based approaches, at least some have adopted that, all the way now to focus on systems and structures and on power and so on. And we argue in the book that both are the legal form of the charity, as it is embedded in laws in many countries, and the norms, both the societal expectations and donor expectations and government expectations, and the inner culture of the NGOs will never allow us to live up to our expanded aspirations unless we make some changes. I would say that's the core argument.
Okay. I'm taking a small step back, because you said in the beginning, the book was written, or the manuscript was finished before the pandemic kicked in, before George Floyd. So is it then, can I then expect that if you would write an updated version of the book now, 2023, taking into account the pandemic, what happened here in the US around George Floyd, and actually that had a kind of a replicating effect within the whole world,
I would say so.
as well. And then the third part is NGOs. Our sector is changing, so especially there are a lot of NGOs that are now led by the younger generation, the next generation, millennials and centennials. And I kind of assume that they are not following that that traditional structure of the charity. I don't know if I'm correct, so I would like to hear from you what your opinion is about that. But okay, the question is, would you, the three of you or the four of you, would you, are you planning to rewrite a book or come up with an extra chapter, knowing what you know now?
I'm smiling because as it happens, we are in the very early stages of discussing that possibility.
Yeah.
I am grateful to say that the book has sold fairly well, especially has been bought by leaders and managers in our sectors, not just by professors or students for graduate school. And so we are considering, yes, whether we will try to go for a second edition. And you bet that we will be focusing on all those aspects that you mentioned. Maybe, and we would expand also. There was a chapter on change management that we had written, and in which to which Barney Talek also made an important contribution. And regretfully, our editors decided to not include that book. Anyway, that we would like to bring back that chapter if we can. Of course, we need to find either our existing publisher, find out if they're interested in a second edition, or whether, if not, whether we contractually then have the ability to go to a different publisher. But yes, we are discussing that.
Okay. I didn't know that, just for the listeners. So that's good. That's good to hear, Tosca. I alluded to what I see is our sector is definitely changing. You described it as well, that we actually have to change, and there are several factors for that. And then you talked about teams,
team coaching.
Team coaching. So can you tell a bit about that's something, that's a service that you have, that you can offer, and why is that important in this changing NGO sector?
Good point. May I just for a moment go back to what you said about post-millennials and
yeah, sure.
Just for a moment, because I do want our listeners to know that in the chapter on digital strategies and tactics, we're actually already in the current edition, the first edition, we are paying attention to how the expectations of post-millennials and their attachment to organizations have really changed, to organizations, including NGOs. So basically, when it comes to fundraising, as well as through doing advocacy and campaigning, generation Y and Z in particular, their allegiance, their attachment, their emotional attachment to nonprofits of any kind is much weaker than that of baby boomers. We know that from the research. We also know that even their attachment or allegiance to causes, though stronger than to organizations, is more fickle than before. And so some NGOs, more than others, have figured out that the way in which they communicate with these younger generations really has to become a two-way conversation, not a one-way broadcast, and that they have to go with the flow in terms of post-millennials wanting to take action in society on their own terms, not in a way that is prescribed by NGOs. I'll stop there, but I just wanted to make that point. That is included in the book.
Okay, that's great. And I did not mention that, you make sure that the book with the link where you can buy the book will be mentioned in the podcast notes, because I really think if you're even a little slightly interested in the topics that are being addressed within this podcast, you definitely should read this book. That's what I think. The other thing what I would like to mention, Tosca, is for those listeners and for you, if you did not listen to the episode with Kees Klomp, not because he is also from the Netherlands, but just because I think he has an interesting view on what is necessary in this world today. But he's saying that we need to look at existential economics, that the problem that we have in this world has to do with that we are still driven by the GDPs and financial growth, and we need to look at thriving. Now he explains also in the podcast with me and in his lectures, actually, that you can find online, is that centennials are driven by purpose and millennials are driven by meaning. So, but they can come together in their actions, but they're the start is different. So anyway, I would really, I often say to people that they should check out that episode, because I really like what he's trying to say. It's very much in line with the donut economics from Kate Raworth.
Got it. I will definitely listen to that, Morris.
Great. I hope the other listeners as well. Hey, Tosca, I would like slowly to go to the second part of the conversation that I always have, because you know that this podcast is a spin-off of my 100-mile walk. But I want to make sure that we addressed, at least some of the main things that we wanted to address in terms of your
team coaching
company and your team coaching, your book. So it's
I think book and my company, we have spoken enough about. If people want to find out more about me, I trust that you have the relevant links in the show notes, so we're not going to talk about that. I wanted to say something about why I was motivated to recently graduate in a program, in a training program on team coaching, and that training program is with Corentus, that is Corentus, based out of Boston here in the US, but definitely a global company. And so they are specializing in team coaching, and they also offer professional development in team coaching. Why do I think it's important? Because I think, so I do a little bit of individual coaching, although I should say very transparently, I am not certified in individual coaching. But a lot of organizational effectiveness issues have as much to do, or lack thereof, or limitations thereof, have as much, if not more, to do with the fact that I see in the NGO sector quite a bit of underperformance at the team level. So what do I see? And again, I'm going to be a little bit kind of, unnuanced, but it's kind of a couple of bullet points. I see a misunderstanding in our sector around what's the difference between a work group and a team, right? Teams are ideally not bigger than somewhere between 5 to 7, at most 10 people. So I see the word team kind of being thrown around fairly sloppily by leaders when they say, oh, I have a team of 30 people. Well, that would not be a team. That would be at most a work group. What makes teams a team is that they produce interdependent products or programs or outcomes, right? So they are interdependent on each other. They need each other to together produce common outcomes and joint products or outcomes or outputs. They need to be mutually accountable, and I see a fair amount of lack of behaviors that actually do indicate that people understand in a team they need to be mutually accountable. I see a fair amount of low quality of decision making, by which I mean lowest hanging common denominators, right? Lowest hanging fruit, and the kind of the dive towards the most common denominators. I see a lot of attempt to go around and around trying to get to consensus in a not too a skillful way. I also see a lack of understanding that sometimes either other forms of decision making, whether it's authority or authority with consultation, to give you one example, may produce both better quality decision making, but also much more agile and adaptive and responsive decision making than I see in our sector. So I see a lack of creativity in how we discuss things in meetings. Very often open discussion instead of other modes of co-creating, if you will. I see a lot of bad meeting management. I see an over-indexing on meetings, meaning we overuse meetings instead of using asynchronous forms of communication. So all of these things, and of course there is the issue of inclusion or lack of inclusion, not feeling respected, lack of diversity, both of identity but also of perspective. So all of those things made me motivated to get trained up in team coaching, and I'm glad to say I am now have just graduated, and I'm really excited to offer that to our sector. That's a long answer.
Yeah,
so.
no, that actually is really exciting. 3 quick questions around it. One is, will you write a book about this?
Not planning to.
Okay, it sounds interesting to me, Tosca. So second is, where can people find more information? Should they just go to your website, and send you an email to understand what you have to offer, and how they can sign up or, start conversations with you about their organizations or about themselves? And then the third part is, I really think we should make a special podcast episode about this. So
sure, if you think it's of interest.
Yeah, no, it's definitely of interest. So yeah.
Okay, so in terms of, no, I'm definitely not thinking of writing a book, because that would be pretty presumptuous. I only just was trained in the kind of not just the basics, but also the more intensive form of training in team coaching. So I definitely don't want to presume that I can write a book about it. I'm really listening a lot to my colleagues at Currentus. They've asked me if I'm interested to become a core practitioner in their practice for part of my time. And I very happily said yes, because I love what I experienced as a trainee at Currentus. And so what I just presented to you is partially drawn of their intellectual property, their concepts, their frameworks, etc. Where can people find out more about this particular offer? Yes, they can go to my website and contact me through that. They can send me an email, and I trust that you'll put these things in the show note. Or they can contact me, for instance, through LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. And so just direct message me there, and I'll be happy to send you also a description of what we can offer as Five Oaks Consulting, including on team coaching.
Great. And let me also take this moment to, talking about podcasts, of course, you should continue to listen to this podcast, but you should also check out the podcast that Tosca have done, and many are, if not all, are really, really interesting. You know that this podcast is a spin-off of a 100-mile walk that I've been doing since 2012. To raise funds and awareness around hunger, poverty, and injustice. And then, during the pandemic, I was not able to be accompanied by co-walkers. So then I came up with the concept of virtual walk.
Right.
And then this got a little bit out of hand. So I'm still doing it, and it's a lot of fun to do. The question that I always ask to my guests, if you would be asked to walk 100 miles in a week, or 5 to 7 days, for which cause would you walk? And,
yeah,
and why?
Yeah, of course, a very hard question. There would be quite a few, but I'll just pick one. So as I told you before, I live in a rural part of New York State, right?
Yeah.
About 5 hours west of New York City. And so for me, the cause of the positive impact when so particularly upstate New York traditionally has been inhabited by immigrants from, historically I'm talking about, from European countries. So outside New York City and outside the bigger cities of Buffalo, Syracuse, and Rochester, a lot of the countryside is fairly white. We have seen a number of really important positive impacts from the arrival over the last couple of decades of refugees and other forms of recent immigrants. And so what is close to my heart is not just the kind of justice aspect of that, of welcoming refugees and recent immigrants into our area, but actually that we are the ones who are benefiting most from that, because both from an economic revitalization perspective, right? So I live in part of what sometimes is called the post-industrial depressed kind of northeast of the US. Recent refugees and immigrant generations have brought a lot of economic revitalization. They have made our region a lot more diverse. They have enhanced the quality of life through the business they start, the restaurants, everything. It is so important for us that we have, quote unquote, welcomed those multiple generations of refugees. And so in the current climate in the US, where there is so much of polarization and of the othering of people who are different from us, I think the argument that actually we are the ones who are most benefiting is a really important one to make, especially when we see sometimes voters who think that the opposite.
Great. No, thank you for that. And I do think you're touching upon a very, a current and relevant topic.
Yeah.
And let's hope that this country will continue to grow, and where we see less polarization. And you talked about interdependency within your teams, and I think as a world we realized for a moment that we are all interdependent during COVID, but then as soon as certain people got access to vaccine, we forgot about that, and we only focused on ourselves and on our own communities. So thank you for that. Walking is for me, and I think for many, a kind of a spiritual experience, and especially if you have to walk 15 to 20 miles a day. You get pain in your joints, and you ask yourself, why do you do this? And what drives me anyway? And so I often talk about religion and spirituality with my co-walkers, and then very quickly, the topic of what is happening with the younger generation. So I'm fascinated by that, because some people are saying, they are less religious, and but they're still spiritual. There are a lot of opinions about it. Although I'm slowly, through this particular podcast, and trying to get a little bit more grip on this. But what do you see happening among youth in your community around religion and spirituality?
So just at a very personal level, so I was raised as a Catholic, and I have the experience that once you're raised as a Catholic, you will never completely not be a Catholic, right? Won't go into that, but it was in some ways important to me, though more from a kind of let's say, pushing back against the hierarchy in Rome, etc. But in my personal life now, I am a Unitarian, and I feel much more at home there because of the fact that Unitarianism is not about dogmas. It's not about hierarchy and institutions, but it's about you figuring out for yourself what both your values are, your spiritual thoughts and belief systems are, etc. It's a very free thinking and fairly, I will say, quote unquote, intellectual form of spirituality that therefore is also populated by a whole bunch of primarily white, highly educated liberals. And that has its real limitations, I have to say. So that's at a personal level. Some of my work is definitely with faith-based organizations. I think faith-based NGOs have enormous assets. And for instance, the trust that through their networks of whether it's mosques or temples or churches, their wide networks of those religious houses, if you will, at the local level, gives them enormous amount of trust within the local population that a lot of secular organizations, frankly, would die for and would covet. And at the same time, many people in this world are still either religious or at least spiritual. And we here in the global north tend to kind of forget that. As you know, here in the US too, secularization is slowly but very significantly increasing. I cannot comment on the Netherlands anymore. But yeah, those are a couple of thoughts. And if I have to link to youth, I will say there are some things that are now used, in my view, as like in a semi-religious manner. Like if you think about the well-being movement and yoga, for instance, or all the non-scientific aspects of the well-being industry, some people seem to have taken this up as a new spirituality or form of religion, which then in my mind perhaps signals the fact that we all as human beings need a purpose, and we need a higher form of transcendence. And so if we don't find it in institutionalized religion, we go and look for it elsewhere.
When I was listening to you, I was thinking about connection. The desire of humans to be part of a community, to be connected with others.
Absolutely.
So that's what I hope this podcast is also doing: connect people to open themselves up to other perspectives, and and maybe then even start a dialogue with people that have another perspective. And I really think that's necessary. You talked maybe 10-15 minutes in about the polarization that's happening, not only in this country but in the world. Yeah. So I have a question always where I try to more intentionally connect you with the previous guest, and the question of the previous guest for you is,
so my question for the next guest is, who is the one person in your professional network whose opinion you want to change? Why? And how are you going to do it? And they don't have to reveal the name of the person, but I think going back to your comment, Maurice, about the IDGs, right? And about one person having an impact, I truly believe in that as well. So you start with one person. Who is that one person who you think is so important that they understand your work or your mission or your drive or your project, who doesn't believe in it today? How would you engage with them to change their mind?
The last question is the hardest, probably. Okay, so asked me to talk about the book before. I told you that the book is published by Oxford University Press. Oxford University Press is one of the probably 2 or 3 top academic presses in the world, right? So it's very renowned amongst academics. I told you that we had wanted to include a chapter on change management. That was the chapter most heavily informed purely by practitioner perspectives, Barney Telleck's and mine, right? That was the one chapter that the 4 peer reviewers in a double-blind review of the book manuscript critiqued the most. That was the chapter that was based on practitioner knowledge, not so much on academic or research data knowledge, but 2 practitioners who collectively at that point had about 60 years of relevant practitioner experience. So I would that was a very difficult experience for me, because that is about whose knowledge counts. Right? And we know that discourse is also happening when it comes to, for instance, indigenous knowledge, the knowledge of Global South NGOs, right? Whose knowledge counts is a very hot topic right now in the international development world, and has been actually on and off for quite a bit longer. But I would have liked to change the mind of those peer reviewers and ultimately the editor who decided to pull that very chapter. And you know what? One of the most common, when people tell me, I like the book, it's useful, it's good, and I'm missing a chapter on change and change management. And we have to say the irony is that was the one that was cut, right? So how would I persuade PhD level reviewers that practitioner knowledge, when it's across many sources and therefore triangulated, right? And over a lot of years of experience, why that would not have the same status. That's what I would like to change. I think we can primarily only change anybody's view if we start with ourselves, but also if we start by sitting down face to face, ideally, and first asking a lot of questions to the person to find out how they're thinking, where they're coming from, and then see can we find common ground. So a lot more use of inquiry, of asking questions, being curious to learn, than to make statements.
No, thank you for that. And for me, the listeners know that I often talk, I try to touch upon, the dance between the I, the we, the it and its perspective, or, some would say the arts, religion, and science. I think that this is the dance, what's often happening. And I have a question to you later about the inner development goals. I think that's also related with what you just lifted up. Okay, your question for the next guest.
Oh my Lord, I'm not ready for this. I did not think of that. What? Okay, I'll just try something. Let me see, how am I going to say this? Whether we talk about, well, let's say, assuming we are still talking about the unit of analysis being either nonprofits, philanthropies, or INGOs, right? Where does our next speaker see the biggest gap between the espoused values, meaning the values that those nonprofits and NGOs say they are all about, and their real actions, habits, and behaviors? So where is that gap the biggest? And what is the result? What do we see as an implication of that? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a tough question, but I don't have to answer it. So my next guest will. So thanks, Tosca. Hey, my listeners know my favorite question is, because music is so important to me, is the following question. And if I ask you to come up with a piece of music or a song that best embodies, for the big part, Tosca is about, which piece of music or song would that be, and why?
Yeah, so I also was completely not ready for that question, and I'm just an average listener to music. I'm going to mention a song that I always enjoy listening to, including when I go to the dentist, as a way of soothing myself. And it's a song by Carly Simon called "You're So Vain." Now, I'm hoping our listeners are not going to think, oh, she must think that she herself is vain. I would like to think that I'm not vain, that I have enough of a sense of humility, etc. But to me, that song, somehow the spirit of the song embodies for me something about strong women who are very resilient, who challenge, who stand up, but also do it in a way where they're not constantly in a coping behavior, like, okay, yes, I can handle this too, I can handle this too, I can handle, keep stacking challenges on top, because it's not very resilient, it's not sustainable, and it's not healthy. So that's going to be my pick.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And we will add that to the Spotify playlist that we have made. If you go to Spotify and you search for hashtag Walk Talk Listen, you will find all the songs that were picked by our guests.
Oh, fun.
And, that's from classical music to, reggae, hard rock, and now Carly Simon will be added as well. Tosca, I mean, even before I became the Chief Sustainability and Impact Officer of my organization, sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals were really important. I have always two questions around this, but I'm asking you only one part of it. I think a week or two ago, another report came out that we are lacking, that we are behind of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And the war and COVID, there are different reasons that are mentioned in that particular report. However, there is also a growing group of people in the world that is saying, you know, one of the reasons that we're lagging behind has to do with that we have never paid, or we are not paying enough sufficient attention to the abilities, skills, and knowledge that we need as individuals and communities and organizations. They did, you know, a little research, and as a result of that research, they came up with the inner development goals. There are 5 goals. They are being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and action. We don't have to make this, you know, too complex, because I you know, we could do another podcast about it. I just would like to have your quick, you know, reaction on what are your thoughts if you hear this inner development goals.
Yeah, so I had never heard about the inner development goals till you told me just before we started recording. So I'm just going to give you some off-the-cuff comments. Being very, very important, obviously, right? And the Buddha and Buddhism and mindfulness have I think by now amply taught us that. So absolutely no question about that. Relating. By now we all know that emotional intelligence is very important. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I think. It matters what the other person perceives, right? That is also very important for influencing, by the way. Thinking, just a quick. Sometimes I'm going to pull this back into the NGO sector for a moment and see if this makes sense to you. I think in the NGO sector, often we seem to think that we can think our way out of an issue. So to give you an example, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So a number of NGOs in their actions, the fact that they focus in their DEI initiatives on things like training, all kinds of forms of training, right? Unconscious bias, et cetera, on book groups, on discussions. In other words, we tend to invest when we want to get better in the field of DEI. We tend to invest in our individual and in our organizations, in our staff's cognitive capacity, the thinking. But actually, when you look at the neuroscience on how people really move, engage in action, which is also one of the inner development goals, as you told me, we see in the neuroscience that actually people don't start with thinking and then from thinking go to action. No, people start with actions. They're prompted, in this case, by the NGO through organizational systems and processes and culture. They're prompted to engage in habits, behaviors, and actions that actually then over time influence how we think about it. So action leads to changes in thinking, much more than thinking leads to different actions. Does that make sense? I'm struck by how I think we're not fully aware of how human beings really, what moves them.
Yeah. Is it also part going back to the team? Is it going back to you know, because when we were talking about the teams, about, you know, interdependence and
mutual accountability,
you know, yeah, and culture within the team, and yeah, so how you experience that. Yeah, so okay. The question is does that play a role in what you know, when you address team dynamics and what you just explained?
Well, to the extent that, so for instance, team practices, whether it is how you run a meeting, who you defer to in a meeting, who you give higher importance, if you will, how teams organize their work, all of these day-to-day, maybe very boring, but day-to-day processes and systems for a team will also affect how people interact with each other and how they start to think about each other, for instance, right? So, for instance, to give you an example, if a lot of people seem to think in our sector that we need to brainstorm in a live meeting about something to get to rich thinking, right? But actually, more and more research indicates that it's more creative to start with brain writing, where everybody first writes individually about a certain challenge, for instance, or an answer to a question, and then people bring that together and they start kind of comparing and enriching that material. So going from brain writing to meeting in a group. These kind of very mundane practices can actually change how we think and how we feel about each other in the team. Does this make sense?
Yeah. Interesting, because for a couple of conversations and meetings, I first do a Mentimeter where people, you ask them to write. Yeah.
A virtual poll.
Exactly. So, and that does help.
Yes.
I have to say that very interesting. Hey, Tosca, I mean, these conversations always go very fast. I still have 2 or 3 questions. I would like you to answer maybe, tweet-wise. So that means you don't have to stick to the 144 characters, but, rather quickly.
Yeah.
The first one is about a message, invitation, or question for the listeners.
Constantly check for yourself whether your habits, behaviors, and actions are reflecting what you say your values are. Your daily habits, behaviors, and actions. I don't mean that in a holy way, right? In a wagging the finger, but I think that's a useful practice.
If I ask you right now, on the spot, to commit one simple act of kindness, what you will do this week, what will you do?
Gosh, so many I could think of, but I'll just say one is truly listen to a person instead of thinking what your next answer is going to be, what you will say next. Very hard.
What is the thing or the issue, what worries you most at the moment?
Worries me most, besides climate change, the othering of people who are unlike you in whatever which way. And that, by the way, happens on all sides of the political spectrum. The othering.
Where do you see hope?
I do think when it comes, you mentioned before kind of simplistic ways of looking at things like economic growth, GDP, etc. I do think that not only do we have now more instruments for measuring at the national and global level well-being, right? But I do think that also here in the US, which is, for instance, a pretty workaholic culture compared to Europe, where you and I both come from, I do think that there is a growing awareness that we need to be more, I don't know, I don't like the word holistic, but a more holistic form of measuring what you use the word thriving, what that means. I do think that across generations, and even to some extent across the political divide, that is increasing.
Any question that I should have asked you?
You've asked me a lot already, and we've talked a long time, I think way too long, so no.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tosca, for your willingness to talk with me today, for everything you do. I really encourage the listeners to check out your website, to check out the book, to check out the podcast. I always learn a lot of talking with you.
Thank you.
So really, really thank you, and good luck.
Thank you. I'll need it. And thank you so much, Morris. This was such a lively and also for me an enriching discussion. You asked some really good questions that make me think again. And the way you hosted this podcast is gives me new ideas for my podcast as well. So thank you for allowing me to learn from you.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen, please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.